Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to yet another exciting Newsmaker interview. Obviously, we want to welcome you here to Patrick Henry College as well. I'm Mike Ferris, the Chancellor of the college, and we have the privilege of this entire series being hosted by and conducted by our distinguished professor here at PHC, Dr. Marvin Orlasky, who is the editor-in-chief of World Magazine. Dr. Orlasky's career is well known here, and we just appreciate his partnership with PHC in many ways. I often have had the opportunity to introduce various people who've spoken at the college as my friend. This man, however, is at the top of the friend list that I've ever had the privilege of introducing. Mark Meckler and I have known each other for approximately a year. And I would say that Mark is one of my 2 or 3 best friends in the entire world at this stage. We have become absolutely soulmates because of a project that you'll hear about today, and I'm not going to tell you any details about it because that'll disturb the interview. But Mark and I work together daily. We talk together multiple times a day, and I have never seen a man with more integrity, more wisdom, funny, all the things that I really value, except he does prefer mountain bikes over road bikes. We do have that small contention between us on that point. Mark is a lawyer, having worked in the area of as an attorney for internet companies and high-tech companies and that from his home in Northern California. He and his wife, Patty, live out in the rural area of Northern California. They have 2 children, a son who's a senior in high school and going to the Marine Corps soon, and they have a daughter who is a hotshot high school debater, and we have her in our crosshairs for PHC. Mark was the co-founder of the Tea Party Patriots, having launched one of the first Tea Party gatherings in the country in Sacramento, California, where he got a good group to come out. He subsequently left Tea Party Patriots and has subsequently formed a group called Citizens for Self-Governance. And Citizens for Self-Governance is the sponsor of the Convention of the States project that is located here in Purcellville, Virginia, and is staffed by a whole bunch of PHC staffers and a couple of others. But the dominant staffers, I see Ann here, and I have to acknowledge that Hillsdale does have at least one staffer. We're not entirely PHC pure. Mark's a wonderful, wonderful, godly man, and you're going to hear an exciting story about how he came to Christ and all kinds of other things. And so I give you my good friend, Mark Meckler.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes, we are going to talk about the 2 things today that are not supposed to be discussed at polite dinner parties, or lunch parties even, as some of you eating here, religion and politics. Start with religion. When you grew up, what belief, well, let's say when you entered San Diego State University, at the same age as a lot of the students here at Patrick Henry, what did you believe? I grew up in Los Angeles. I was a secular Jew, and really going into college, no set of beliefs about religion. I really had never attended church or synagogue, and so I was pretty much neutral on religion at that point. Okay, and then you took a religious studies course, and did that help? Did that move you from neutrality? Yeah, I took a bunch of religious studies courses. I've always felt like if you don't understand religion, you don't understand the human being. It's the prime moving force on Earth. And so I wanted to understand that from a scientific perspective. So I took a series of religious studies courses, world religions and such, and I came away from that a militant atheist, really. You know, in those classes, what you get taught is sort of the scientific view of religion. And what they teach you is everything bad that religion has ever done on planet Earth. And so I came away, really, I would have described myself at that point as a militant atheist. Okay, and you were an English major at San Diego State. Correct. And what was your favorite book at that time? Probably, for sure, Atlas Shrugged. Okay. Somebody introduced me to Atlas Shrugged. I was always attached to the idea of personal liberty and freedom, and I grew up in a very patriotic family, so the idea of the individual, and I'm probably that's where some of that militant atheism came from, too. Right. Okay, and then to law school, where I'm told you had a blue mohawk. Yeah, well, there are no pictures. No pictures, thank God.
I did. You know, I got into law school, and in about the first 2 months of law school, I was really thrown for a loop. I would describe myself as a rebel and kind of a nonconformist. And for those of you who've been to law school, or if you're thinking of going to law school, I'll tell you who you meet in law school is everybody who ever wanted to be the class president at your high school. And they're all trying to conform to some ideal of what a law student is or is supposed to be or supposed to look like. And I was really bothered by that. And my pushback was one day to walk downtown to a punk rock hairdresser and ask for a blue mohawk. It definitely changed how I was treated on campus.
And how were you treated at that point?
Well, so I'm a student who I love the Socratic method. I mean, just nothing better for me. And being engaged that way in the classroom, I absolutely love that. And so I would say that my teachers generally liked me because I was the guy who was always wanting to participate, not hiding in the back. About 3/4 of my teachers refused to look at me after that. It was so disturbing to them to have me in the classroom, and it threw them for a loop so badly that they just stopped calling on me. I had one professor one day who came up to me in the hall, and I'll never forget him, Professor Curtis, very serious guy, real property professor. And he stopped me in the hall about 3 or 4 days after I got the haircut. And he was one of the guys who kept calling on me, the same. And he said, "Mr. Meckler, what's with the hair?" And I said, I don't know, Professor Curtis. I was a little intimidated. I just do it to mess with people's heads. And he said, "I like it," and marched off down the hallway.
All right. And when you went for interviews for corporate law internships, did you have your blue mohawk at that time?
No, and I'm a rebel, but I'm a practical rebel. Right. So you'll know no tattoos or anything like that or piercings, because I always believed that, I didn't want it to affect the outcome in the end. I always wanted the option. It's okay to rebel, but I wasn't intending on being a permanent rebel.
Okay, so hairstyles can change, but tattoos are always with you.
Exactly.
So, and then you got out of school and you're a lawyer, and I know you're married and you have a couple of children. Right. How long after that did you get married?
So I got out of law school. I actually was married straight out of law school.
Really? Okay.
So I married a fellow lawyer. I don't recommend that, by the way. And this is, I think, part of what started to turn me to faith. About 1.5 years out of law school, I ended up in a really nasty divorce, and something I never saw coming and didn't want, and it really was a very dark place for me. My parents are now married 53 years, thank God, and so I had this great role model. I was expected to be married my whole life, and when I ended up going through this divorce, it was just really dark, and I just couldn't understand why it was happening, and that's really part of what started me seeking something bigger, that there had to be something else going on.
Okay, and then what happened as far as you're divorced, and then when did you remarry?
So towards the end of coming out of my divorce, I met my wife.
Okay.
And God put her in my path for multiple reasons. I think one was to help me heal, and she was the right person at the right time. She was a person of faith, raised in the Catholic Church. And she's 5 years younger than me, but she was a lot wiser than I was. She'd been through a lot more in her life, spiritually and emotionally, than I had, and had a lot more wisdom and maturity in that way. And she helped guide me sort of out of that dark place. We ended up married about 2 years after that. So okay. Divorced and married 2 years later.
Okay, did her religious beliefs affect you?
Yeah, there was actually a little bit of conflict around it because she came from a Catholic family, big Catholic family. Her family had always participated in the church. She's definitely described herself as a Christian, a little bit alienated from the Catholic Church itself, but a devout Christian nonetheless. And so for her, it was difficult to deal with the idea that I was an atheist and the idea of getting serious with and marrying somebody who was an atheist. We had a lot of interesting discussions around it, and I ended up, I would say I ended up winning to our detriment. In other words, when we decided we'd get married, she would practice her way, I would not practice my way, and we agreed that we would raise the kids and let them make their own choices. In hindsight, a terrible mistake on my part.
And making their own choices essentially meant just a secular understanding. There wasn't any particular religious observances or background or faith that they developed, your two kids?
We were, and I would say still are, a very culturally Jewish family, okay. Very proud of our Jewish heritage and the traditions and heritage of the Jews as a people. And we celebrated Hanukkah in a non-religious sense. In the same sense a lot of people celebrate Christmas. We lit them.
Did you have a Hanukkah bush?
We did, as a matter of fact. Growing up, it was white, and it had blue ornaments on it with a Jewish star on the top.
All right. All right.
Just for good measure. And, you know, we lit the menorah, and we knew generally the Hanukkah story, but that was pretty much it. And so it was very, it was secular with religious overtones. When I was growing up, we had a Passover Seder, but we did not do that as a family after I married Patty. So the kids grew up in this very, I would say, sterile, from a religious perspective, environment. We talked about religion in much the same way I learned about it in college, so though not as negative, but certainly just, you know, this is religion, this is Christianity, this is Judaism, this is what people believe. God was not in an overt way, not coming out of me, present in those discussions.
Okay, and you're then pursuing your law career, family's growing, not involved in politics at all, living in Northern California. Then what happens? And maybe this we can bring in here the story of Tim Dunn.
Sure. Well, so the Tea Party movement happened, and there's a guy by the name of Rick Santelli on CNBC who does this now famous rant saying, you know, the bailouts are bad, and making people who've done the right thing pay for people who've done the wrong thing is un-American. And I saw that and was inspired by that, because I agree with that. And I, like a lot of people in America, were really frustrated with the direction of the country. This is shortly after President Obama is elected, but a lot of us who are conservative, and I've always been a very solid conservative, were incredibly frustrated, especially by the economic policies of George Bush. And I remember a moment when Bush said on national television that he was abandoning free market principles to save the free market. And I felt like I was watching a Dr. Seuss special instead of a presidential press conference. And so I'd been very frustrated thinking, who is it in Washington, D.C. that represents me? If the Republican president isn't speaking a language I understand, who is? Barack Obama becomes president, and we see essentially more of the same, especially from an economic perspective of Bush's policies. So when Santelli does his rant, it really ignites a fire in me and millions of other people.
So you saw that on the news, or?
I actually saw it on a YouTube clip that somebody had forwarded to me.
Someone forwarded it to you, and so you're saying, right, yeah, and then what happens? How do you get involved?
Well, he calls for a tea party, and he calls for it in July on the shores of the lake there in Chicago. And they're using Twitter under the hashtag of TCOT. There are conservatives, that's top conservatives on Twitter, and it's just a ranking engine for conservatives on Twitter. And somebody puts out a message, a guy by the name of Michael Patrick Leahy, who's actually here in Virginia, puts out a message saying, we should do something with this. And we're going to hold a conference call. That was on the 19th that Santelli did his rant, February 19th, 2009. On the 20th, there's a conference call. 22 people showed up on that conference call. And I was not one of them. I wasn't using Twitter at the time. My co-founder, Jenny Beth Martin, was one of them. And they decided that they should do this Tea Party thing a week later, not to wait till July like Santelli.
And who came up with the name Tea Party?
Santelli did. He actually called for a new American Tea Party.
Okay.
And just said we needed that spirit to rise again in America. And so they proposed that we do it on February 27, 2009. You know, I'm a little bit of a slow starter. I heard about it 2 days later, so I was late to the movement. But somebody told me, hey, you need to look at these pages on Facebook. These people are holding these protests. This is really interesting. I saw it. I was inspired by it. I did the right thing and asked my wife's permission, so I didn't get in trouble. And she's from Boston originally, so the idea of a tea party really appealed to her.
Okay.
And so we organized a tea party for 5 days later in Sacramento at the state capitol, and without any knowledge of even what a tea party was.
And you and
my wife, Patty.
Okay, just the two of you?
Just the two of us, yeah.
Okay, all right.
So crazy people going down to protest. You know, conservatives, we don't protest. We don't even know what that means. And I invited my parents. They're retired. I knew they had time, and they're rebel rousers too. And I took my kids out of school because kids are always looking for a good excuse to skip school.
So suddenly you've gone from 2 to 6.
So I knew we'd have 6 of us, exactly. Yeah. I was excited because, you know, at least I had my little family cocoon. And we were going down to the state capitol. It's a little intimidating. We don't know anything about protesting. We have a good sense of humor, so we made some funny signs. And we showed up down there.
So give us an example of the funny sign.
Well, you know, so part of what we'd done is they were just general signs about government. And so one of the signs I recall was, it said something like, show me a good government program, I'll show you a unicorn.
Okay.
So because, you know, one of the things that we have these discussions with our liberal friends all the time in our town is, so point to the government program that you think is run really well so that when we look at new government programs, we know what to emulate. Right. And obviously none of our friends can point to any of those programs. So we were just trying to have a good time, and we showed up, the first people to greet us. I was hoping other protesters would be there. They weren't when we first got there. The police were there, telling us that we were not allowed to protest without a permit. You know, we don't know. We're conservatives, right? We don't know you need a permit. Luckily, my mom is retired law enforcement, so they were nice to us, and they ended up giving us a permit on the spot. 150 people showed up, roughly.
Okay.
I was stunned. First of all, there were 149 other crazy people like me that would come out to one of these protests. But I went around and I talked to every person there. I was just fascinated that they were there and asked them why. I knew why I was there. And they all gave an answer that was very similar to what I would have said, which is, I'm compelled to be here. It's not really a choice. I came because I don't know what else to do. I came because I vote, I participate, and then people go to Washington and they do things I don't even recognize. Or they go to Sacramento and do things I don't even recognize. And so I don't know what else to do. They came out of a sense of despair, frustration, desperation. That was the common theme. And they were from all walks of life. This was the most important thing to me. You know, at the time in California, Prop 8 was really hot. I mean, we were in the midst of that fight. And there with us at this protest were gay rights activists.
And Prop 8 defined?
Marriage and Family Act, in defense of family, defining marriage between a man and a woman. So there on the sidewalk in Sacramento were gay rights activists and marriage and family folks, and instead of hitting each other with signs, they're holding up the same kind of signs. Basically, the theme was, just get government off our backs. You know, we're the people, we can figure it out ourselves.
Okay, so you've moved from 6 to 150, and then what happens?
So that's successful as far as I'm concerned. We go home, and I'm just a networker by nature. I love people, and so I wanted to talk to everybody else who had done one of these events. So I started looking at all the Facebook pages and finding contact info and calling them, in California first. What did you do? What worked? Did you have as much fun as we did? Was it exciting? And that was sort of what I would call, for people who are tech geeks like me, it was an open source political movement starting to develop, and we were developing the source code. I learned if you go on state property, you need a permit. And so I needed to tell everybody that. And in other places, they learned if you have 500 people, you need a PA system. You can't do this with your voice alone. And so this source code started developing, and I became the de facto coordinator for California because everybody knew me. So somebody in San Diego would say, who do we ask about this? And they would say, call Meckler, because he called me.
Gotcha.
Then I started calling around the country once I exhausted California, and ended up finding out there were roughly 35 of these that had taken place all over the country on 1 week's notice. About 39,000 people, by our estimation, came out. Out of those calls, there ended up being a core group of 5 of us that came together and decided to do something again. And we thought if on a week's notice we had had almost 40,000 people come out, 35 of these around the country, what would happen if we had 6 or 7 weeks' notice? And so that's when we came up with the idea of Tax Day Tea Party, which was the big one that most people know about, and scheduled that for April 15th because, well, you know, most people are frustrated with the government on April 15th.
Right.
Seemed like the right day. And we had this huge goal. You know, the term audacious has been a little tainted because of the president's books, but an audacious goal of maybe we could have 100 of these around the country. And we started promoting them on Facebook. We also had a page then, our first web page, taxdayteaparty.com. We started promoting this, and in the first couple of days, we exceeded our 35. By the end of the first week, we were 100, 150 of people who were emailing us and saying, can you list our event on your webpage? And we were just beside ourselves. We couldn't believe what was going on. We'd obviously tapped into something not created by us, but something that already existed. It got up to 200 and 250, and then we started to get calls, a variety of us from Fox News, asking if they could come cover our events, and which they did. Neil Cavuto wanted to come out to Sacramento, cover our event. Hannity went to Atlanta. We had Greta Van Susteren in Washington, D.C., and it seems fitting somehow Glenn Beck wanted to go to the Alamo, right?
Right.
So once that coverage started and they started talking about they were going to be at these events, it just went crazy.
And so at what point does a spontaneous movement of this sort become an organization?
So we went through to April 15th. By April 13th, we had 850 events listed on the website. You know, God is intervening and creating a movement in a big way at this point, in my opinion, and things
But at this point, you didn't really see God.
I didn't see God in it. I just saw a movement happening. You know, that's hindsight. In hindsight, you see God in everything, right? If you've got a little bit of wisdom.
Sure.
And so the thing is exploding. We do our events. I have 20,000 people show up in Sacramento. You know, I'm not a skilled community organizer like our president. I don't have that background. So the fact that you have to see God, 20,000 people show up in Sacramento because I hold this event, right? In Atlanta, we have 25,000. At the Alamo, close to 20,000. DC, 8,000. And more importantly, the story across the country, little towns where 1,000 people show up in little tiny towns. And so when that event is over, the 5 of us come together and say, well, what now? And a couple of the people wanted out. They had other organizations, other things they were doing. Smart Girl Politics is one of them. They're still out there, great conservative women. And so they went back to what they were doing, and a few of us said, well, we can't stop. Something's happening. We're stewards of whatever that is. And so we formed an organization called Tea Party Patriots to be the go-forward grassroots organizing mechanism for that movement.
Okay, and that grows, but at a certain point, there's a division in the leadership, and you're out.
Right.
When was that?
So that was in, it's almost 2 years now, February of 2012. And the organization has grown incredibly. At that point, we had raised in the previous 12-month period $14 million, just an extraordinary amount of money. At that point, we had a bigger, fresh email list than Heritage Foundation. I mean, just incredible things are happening. And from my perspective, the organization is moving further and further away from the grassroots that it was founded to represent. We're becoming, as is really common with big, fast-growing organizations, we're becoming a big organization. And I'm uncomfortable with that because I'm just I know I don't look like it now, I'm just a cowboy. I mean, if the guys from Patrick Henry that know me know that it's rare to see me in shoes like this, because normally I'm in scuffed up cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and what I'd like to be doing is riding horses and shoveling stalls. And so as I see the organization doing this and starting to really play Washington politics, and the leadership is going to the fancy parties and riding in the black cars, I'm uncomfortable with that. And then for me, kind of the break point was, I'm not a Republican. And about 12 years ago, I left the Republican Party because the party left me. And I just wasn't comfortable with the party anymore, didn't represent who I was. And I was on TV a lot at this point. So I'd gone from this totally private guy who's not on Facebook, who's not on Classmates.com, who has an unlisted phone number, to being on television all the time. My life has radically changed. And the main thing I'm saying on TV is you need to understand we're not partisan. We're not about the Republican Party. We're not trying to get a Republican president. What we're trying to do is bring government back to the people.
Was there some other party that appealed to you?
No.
Okay.
No, I felt no party was representing me, or frankly, most of the American people at this point. And so then the organization made a decision at the board level to cut a check for $250,000 to the Southern Republican Leadership Conference. A good organization, but a Republican organization nonetheless. And I couldn't go on TV any longer and say we were nonpartisan. That was really when the parting of ways really happened.
Okay, so that's the political chain here.
Right.
Let's now go to the spiritual track.
Okay.
Essentially, what's happening to you at this point, and maybe this is where Tim Dunn comes into the story.
Well, so early on in the movement, what starts happening is I start crossing paths with really righteous Christians that are involved in the political sphere, and I'm meeting people who, by what they profess to me, by who I know they are, by how they're introduced, are really devout Christians. I'm meeting people, I'm having the opportunity to meet extraordinary leaders like Dr. Dobson. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting with these people, and they're unique to me. And they are powerful people who seem personally unaffected by their own power, who have a humility about them that is missing in a lot of the other people that I'm meeting around the country that are powerful people. And I'm very attracted to that. And I'm just impressed person after person that I'm meeting. In hindsight, this is, now God is starting to thump me in the forehead and try and get me to pay attention. And I'm not paying attention really at that point from a spiritual perspective. I am noting that these people are Christians. And I'm paying attention to how they live and that they're actually walking the path. And I'm really impressed by that because that's different than what I've been taught in college.
Right. So from what you've been taught in college or other stereotypes you picked up, what did you think of Christians?
Boy, it's a little embarrassing to say, but I would say, people who speak one way about being followers of Christ and who behind closed doors behave in an entirely different way.
Okay.
Who use their Christianity as a cover for doing things that are not necessarily nice or honest, but they go to church on Sunday and they let everybody know they go to church on Sunday, so somehow they're forgiven, and so that's some sort of cover for bad actors.
Okay.
And so that's probably the stereotype I would say I had in my head before I started to get into politics. And unusual, I think, to have a political pathway to Christ.
Yeah, it usually, in fact, tends to be people losing faith in the process rather than gaining it. Okay, so tell us then, when does the penny drop?
Okay, well. So prior to this time, I've done a lot of exploration in my life. As I came out of the divorce, I'm seeking other things. I've looked at Eastern philosophy. I've studied Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism. and all these different philosophies. And I find them interesting and appealing on an intellectual level, but nothing that ever reached me at a heart level.
A lot of Jewish Buddhists.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jew-boos.
Jew-boos, as we call them. The primary Buddhist thinkers in America the majority of them are Jewish. And so that's all appealing to me, but it doesn't provide me with any great answer or satisfaction. I stumbled my way, believe it or not, into quantum physics and start reading quantum physics theory. And now I'm a lawyer, so I'm by training very logical and methodical. And I have to be convinced, and I start reading quantum physics, and what I find in quantum physics is the search for God through science. Okay. It's really interesting as you read quantum physics, and if you've studied particle theory at all, now they've discovered that a particle of light can be in two places at one time, which is scientifically impossible. Well, God can do that, right? But science can't explain it. And so I'm reading this and I'm realizing, and they're searching for the God particle, and so I start to have this door opens for me that there is this crossover point between logic and science and faith. And that opens the door for me. And then I meet Tim Dunn.
Tim Dunn's a fellow in Midland, Texas.
Yeah, he is a West Texas oilman, self-made millionaire in Texas. Incredible guy. Very, in my opinion, a very well-educated, self-taught theologian. Spent years studying scripture and philosophy. And we start having these deep philosophical talks. He actually approaches me politically first. And it's an unusual approach. He says he wants to help me. And I've become cynical about politics at this point. And I ask him, what do you want from me? I've learned everybody, if they want to help you in politics, generally they also want something from you in exchange. And I've found that it's much easier if you ask them up front what they want. So I asked him what he wants from me. And in his West Texas drawl, he says, well, that's awful blunt, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I said, if there's a value exchange we can do here, I'm open to that, but I don't want to disappoint you. I don't want you to think you're going to get something, because I'm not going to trade my principles. And he said, I want to help you in any way I can. My only condition is that you stay exactly who you are and you don't trade any of your principles for anything ever. And I was stunned by that. I mean, nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. So we started working together, and as part of our work together, we started talking philosophy, politics, and history, and naturally religion starts to come in. He's a devout Christian, and we start talking about Christianity. And one of Tim's passions and one of his personal ministries is to restore what he sees as the missing Judaic heritage from Christianity, is to really bring that back into mainstream Christianity. And so he starts talking to me about that, and as a Jew, obviously that resonates with me. And he starts teaching me history, and there's a history that is an untaught history that is incorrect that I think most Jews have. All my friends who are Jews have this history, which is, it's funny because it's a little weird for me to say this to you because nobody ever told me this, right? This is just a belief that I grew up with. I couldn't tell you where it came from. That the history is that Christ is born, Christ lives, Christ is crucified. If you're a Jew, you say, then Christians say that Christ was resurrected. If you're a believer, obviously we say Christ was resurrected. And that the belief is, if you're a Jew, and again, nobody ever said this to me, but the belief is that there is an absolute schism and separation that takes place there, and the Jews go one way and the Christians go another way. And you don't know anything as a Jew about Paul, or just about the idea that these were all Jews who were now believers that the Messiah had come. That's a profound change of paradigm when somebody tells you that. I mean, it's really stunning. I remember when Tim first said it to me, literally, I can't use a better word than I was just stunned and shocked and almost
Now you knew that Jesus was a Jew.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Paul, Peter, Stephen, others that
I didn't know about Paul and Stephen and Peter. Yeah. So all I knew is Jesus is crucified, Jesus is resurrected, and then there are Jews, and then there are Christians. Yeah. And so Tim starts digging into the history with me and teaching me the 150 years after the resurrection, and teaching me, having me read Paul's writings, and that Paul is preaching as a Jew to the Jews. He's preaching that he's a Hebrew among Hebrews. Well, there's a door that opens if you're a Jew when you hear that it's not open otherwise, because you believe. And again, it's a little weird for me to say this because nobody ever said this to me, but you believe it would be a betrayal of your heritage, of who you are as a person if you're a Jew that becomes a Christian. And when you learn the true history, there's a completely different door that opens.
Yeah, even secular Jews, and again, we come from the same type of background here, even those who look upon Judaism as silly and sort of being part of the Mickey Mouse Club,
Right.
nevertheless, you're part of the Mickey Mouse Club. Why are you going to go and join the Donald Duck Club?
Well, and I would say it even more seriously. Why are you going to join the people who historically have persecuted your people for all of history?
Yeah.
And so I think, so then Tim and I started talking more about where the history of persecution came from, and talking about Augustus and that, the 14th century Augustine and all these changes that had taken place historically over the church, and what were the historic reasons for it, and who were the personalities behind it. That truth, and I mean truth not from a theological perspective, I mean truth from a historical perspective, absolutely changed my view of religion and Christianity in general. It created an opening that could not have been there for somebody like me otherwise.
No, I've known folks who, as you did, have explored this and realized that in many ways, as Edith Schaeffer put it in the title of the book, Christianity is Jewish, and that all makes an impression. But nevertheless, the social pressures really hold them back.
Right.
One person for years was coming further and further in belief, but the thought of leaving behind that community and alienating parents and so forth really held him back. So in your case, let me just ask some practical questions
Sure.
here. As you're going deeper into this and you're seeing this as true, you start to talk about this with your parents.
Right.
And what's their reaction?
I didn't actually talk to my parents about it until I had accepted Christ.
Okay.
So it wasn't really along the way. And, it's really important that I say about my parents, I have an incredibly close relationship with my parents, and they are my heroes. I get a little choked up. They're my mentors. Everything I am in this world, I owe to them, and we're still to this day very close. So the reason I didn't talk to them about it along the way is because I knew what their position was. My
Sure.
dad is an atheist, and I respect his decision there, and I understand his reasoning. We've had many years of conversation about it, religious and philosophical. My mom is a believer in God in the general sense, a believer in a higher being and a higher power, but no specific religious beliefs. So I knew where they were at, and so I didn't really feel like having that discussion with them would be helpful. It might be a little disturbing for them, if anything, as I was working
Sure.
my way through this. When I told them, when I presented it to them, my dad was surprised. I think it was a little hard for him, primarily on a mentoring level. Like, he'd been my mentor my whole life, and now I had somebody else who was mentoring me in the spiritual realm, and Tim Dunn. I think that's tough for any dad. It would be tough for me having an 18-year-old son. And my mom was just, as my mom always is, just super accepting. And to be fair, my dad's really accepting too. There was this literally moment, I think, where he was a little taken aback. But they've both been fantastically accepting about it.
And in God's providence, he may be leading them.
I certainly pray about it all the time. And, and I thank him all the time that people were praying for me. There was this really, along the way, you asked when the penny dropped. And this is not so much when I would say that I came to believe in Christ, but I had a moment about a year and a half into the Tea Party movement, and things were going crazy well. It was hard for us. We were spending all our money. We were literally flat broke at the time. I'd spent every penny I'd saved on the movement. I quit working as a lawyer. So Patty and I were broke, and I was traveling a lot, like I still do for the movement. And I hate traveling. I love being at home with my kids and my wife, and at the time, horses and all that stuff. So I've been on the road a lot, and I think I've been on the road, 7 to 10 days, and I came home one night, or on a red eye. I try to get home as much as I can, so I fly red eyes. And I drove up the hill to our place in rural, a little town called Grass Valley, an hour from the airport. When I got home, I looked at my computer and realized I had a speaking engagement that night. And I was one unhappy camper. And I was frustrated and resentful and everything I shouldn't have been. Really a privilege when a group wants you to come speak. But I was tired, and I just wanted to be home with my family. And I remember just having a really bad attitude about it. And all day long, I just kept thinking, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And eventually I did, out of a sense of duty. And I got into my truck, and I drive this huge F-350 Ford dually pickup with Tea Party on the back. And it's big and obnoxious. We call it the Prius eater in my family, by the way. My kids encouraged me to get right on the bumper of every Prius on the freeway. So that truck was fairly new to me at the time. I'd bought it right before the movement started. So I'm driving down the hill, back down another hour from Grass Valley down to Sacramento area where my speaking engagement was. And on the way, I get a call from a legislative aide, a state legislator's aide, who I'm not happy with. And we start to have this very heated argument. And it's not nice. And I'm swearing, and he's swearing, and I'm angry, and he's angry. It goes on for quite a while. So now I'm filled with all kinds of bad things, right? I'm resentful that I have to go speak at this meeting. I'm angry at this guy and his legislator. And my fuel light comes on, and I pull off the freeway to go get fuel. And we're still having an argument, by the way. And so I fill the truck with fuel, and I get back in the truck, and I get on the freeway and go on my way, still arguing. And all of a sudden, my truck starts shaking and chugging, and I say, I've got to go, something's wrong with my truck. And I pull over to the side of the freeway, and my truck is dying. And in that moment, I realize, so I have this new diesel that I've just filled with gasoline. And I know what I've done. I don't know how bad it is, but I know it's bad. And so then I start to fill myself with another really bad emotion, which is self-hate. And I can't believe what an idiot I am, and how could I be so stupid? And then comes the self-pity on top of that, because now we're completely broke, and I know I've done all this damage to my truck. How are we going to pay for this, and what am I going to do? And then I think, okay, I got to call this group that I'm supposed to go to. And I look on my phone, on my computer, on all the information. I don't have a phone number for anybody. So now, all this bad stuff, now I'm going to stand them up, right, on top of everything else. And in hindsight, I think, I got to be careful what I ask God for, because I told him I didn't want to go to this meeting, right? And so I'm sitting on the side of this dark freeway in Sacramento by myself in this very deep hole. And I call Patty, and she tries to console me, and there's no consoling me. And my kids are on the phone trying to console me. There's no consoling me. And I'm sitting on the side of the freeway, and in a bad place. And it was the first time in my life I ever prayed. And it was a really weird experience, because I just got to this point where I didn't know what else to do. And I also felt really guilty in praying in that moment, because I wasn't a believer. And so there was this mixed thing in me, like, I don't know what else to do except for get on my knees and go to God. And I don't even believe in God, so what am I doing? But I did pray, and my wonderful wife came down and rescued me, and we ended up dropping off the truck at a mechanic at night nearby. Had it towed there and dropped off. And I went home. I was still full of self-pity and loathing, and went home and sort of cried myself to sleep in my own pity pot. And when I woke up in the morning, I got a call from the mechanic, and he said, look, I'm going to look at your truck, and the good news is I've done hundreds of these. Like, lots of people do this all the time. A lot of people put gas in a diesel engine. And I told him it didn't make me feel any better to be in the company of a lot of stupid people. And he said, it's probably $3,000 to $5,000 worth of damage. If it's the injectors, if it's the whole engine, you're looking at $10,000 to $11,000. And I'm thinking, I don't know how I'm going to make my mortgage payment or my car payment next month, let alone that. Well, people in the movement start hearing about what happened to me, and I start getting calls from people. First is a friend of mine who's a diesel mechanic, and he said, I'm here at my prayer group, and we're praying for you. Man, this story, I've told this story a lot of times, and I can't tell it without choking up. And when he told me that, I appreciate it in a way that somebody says, we're thinking about you. I didn't appreciate it in the sense that I understood what it means when somebody prays for you, and like I do now. Then another person called and said, hey, we heard what happened, we're praying for you. And throughout the day, probably 20 people called and said they were praying for me. And by the end of the day, my attitude was just really nice, and I feel really privileged that all these people care about me. But the idea that people were praying for me had almost no impact on me. And at the end of the day, I got a call from the mechanic and with the bad news. And he said, I've been doing this 25 years. I've worked on hundreds of these. People do exactly what you did. We drain the fuel. We put in new filters, put it on, run the diagnostics. In 25 years, I have never seen this. I can't explain it. There's nothing wrong with your truck. It's impossible. But there's nothing wrong with your truck. I don't. And in that moment, I knew exactly what happened. And it rushed. I would describe it in hindsight as I felt the Holy Spirit, because in that moment I understood that people all over the place were praying for me, and it's a small thing, and it's a truck, and so in a way that's kind of embarrassing to say that my miracle is that God fixed my truck. But I think it was God leading me down the path. And that was the moment that I really opened. And that's when I really started investigating in earnest and really started digging in.
And among lots of people from Jewish backgrounds, while a lot of kids who grew up in church are singing about how sweet the name of Jesus is, it's not a sweet name for people from Jewish backgrounds. I mean, how did you start thinking about Christ?
That was really because of Tim Dunn. Because Tim started mentoring me and suggesting, we actually appropriately, I think, started with Hebrews. Mm-hmm. It's the first place he had me dig into Scripture and really understand Hebrews. And so we were having, what was really helpful was it wasn't just somebody saying, you should believe. And in fact, Tim was mentoring me to Christ in a way that's the only way I could have come, which is he was not evangelizing in the traditional sense. He wasn't telling me, look, you need to be saved. You need to come to Christ. And if you don't, here's what happens. He was talking to me where I was, which was as a lawyer, as a real logical guy, as a Jew, and trying to feed me what he thought would lead me down the path. And so just more and more Scripture and more time spent with Tim. He teaches a online Bible study. He teaches it at Midland, Texas. But I get the podcast every week. So when I was out on my run, I was listening to it. I was studying along with it. It just started to make sense to me. And meanwhile, I was still going down the scientific path, and Tim knew that. And he turned me onto a TED Talk. Any of you guys ever listen to TED Talks? If you don't, they're really great, high-end, very intellectual talks packed into 8 minutes or less. And he turned me onto a TED Talk on the Big Bang. And this particular guy, I believe, is an astrophysicist, and he's talking about the Big Bang. And he says, we all us astrophysicists believe that the Big Bang is how everything got started. And before the Big Bang, there was nothing. None of us know. There aren't even really any widely accepted theories about what came before the Big Bang. And he said, so that means if you believe in the Big Bang, you have to believe in magic. Because there was nothing, and then there was something, and we have no explanation. It's like pulling the rabbit out of that. It's magic. So the question you have to ask yourself as a logical person is, do you believe in magic with or without a magician? Which is more logical? And it's just purely matter of logic. If you're a really logical person, you get stuck there because you got to believe in the magician. And that was also really a turning point for me to start believing in God as the creator.
Okay. I'm going to have to bring us down, because time is moving on. I'm going to bring us down to something then mundane. You've left Tea Party, Patriots. You now are running an organization called Citizens for Self-Governance.
Right.
And your big project is a convention of the states. And maybe if you can do this real
sure.
briefly, explain to folks what that is and what your hopes are concerning it.
Sure. Well, this was really Mike Ferris's idea, which is that in the Constitution, in Article 5, in the second clause of Article 5, it gives us the power as citizens to gather together through the mechanism of the states, by 2/3 of the states calling for an amending convention under Article 5. It's really interesting when you look at the history, and this is something, again, that Mike taught me, is that when the founders were in the process of putting together the Constitution, towards the end of the convention, George Mason stood up and said that he was frustrated. I'm going to paraphrase essentially what he said. He was frustrated because the way we had proposed to have in the Constitution of amending the convention was to let Congress propose amendments that they would deem necessary. And that's in there. That's the first half of Article 5. But he said that it was outrageous to think that a government who had become tyrannical would actually propose such amendments as to restrain its own tyranny. And if you just think of that logically, of course, all of us say, yeah, that's ridiculous, And so if you look at it today and you take that forward in context, isn't it a little bit ridiculous for us to expect that Washington, D.C. is ever going to propose anything that would reform itself and take away its own power and its ability to tyrannize the people? I could tell you from traveling all over the country that the people widely believe that we are tyrannized by our government. And I say widely, I don't mean communities like here at Patrick Henry. I don't mean just communities of faith. I don't mean just people on the right or the Tea Party or Republicans. I speak a lot to and with left-leaning organizations, and most citizens believe that we're being tyrannized by our own government. They believe that the government has outgrown its constitutional bounds and that we can't restrain Washington, D.C. from Washington. So Article 5 allows us to call an amending convention. The states get together and do that, 2/3 of the states. And we have proposed a call for that convention to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. And so we are now engaged in an active project. It's based here in Purcellville. I think we have a staff 8 now. Are there 8 of you guys on staff? 6 on staff full-time in the office, and the goal is to create the grassroots movement and the legislative action necessary to get an Article 5 amending convention called. We've now have pre-filings in 4 states around the country. We expect that we're going to pass this in between 10 and 15 states around the country in the upcoming legislative session. The momentum is there. Mark Levin recently wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments around this same subject, perfect parallel. Rush Limbaugh's on board, Sean Hannity, most of the major talkers and thinkers on the right are on board. And so it's going to take us, the citizens of this country, to reform, to refound, and to save the country. And that project is based right here in Purcellville.
So in a way, there are 3 parts, as I've been trying to think about this, just learning about it the past couple of weeks. I mean, there are 3 parts to this. I mean, number one, is the problem in Washington as bad as you say it is? And I'd agree with that. And I suspect lots of people would just look at it and see this is really a mess. Number 2, can you get this done in terms of having 34 states calling for this, which would require still, I mean, a big change from where it is right now in terms of the number of state legislatures and so forth.
Right.
And it's not as if conservatives are all united on this. Okay, so, maybe, maybe not, so forth. But then I start thinking, okay, number 3, if you're able to do this, I mean, let's play some chess here.
Yep.
Okay, you have these plans and you think, okay, we're going to do this and we'll be able to limit government in this way. So far, this is pretty much proceeding beneath the radar screens of the left. I mean, I saw one article on Slate
Right.
And so forth, but that's pretty much it. I mean, if you actually make progress, and as the other side is watching on this, what do they do? And why do you think this would lead to the type of outcome that you want?
So the leading participant from the left, first of all, we are
Larry Lessig,
and we are actively working to engage the left. So we're not trying to proceed under the radar of the left. We want them on board. The process can't be legitimate without them on board. And to get to 34, you're going to need some support from the left. 24 states, we believe, pretty easy. We've got both houses and a governor in 24 states. And we can probably get to 30, I think. To get to 34 is a stretch, and that's where we're going to require help from the left. So, but when I talk to the left, look, most of them want the same thing that we do. When I say most of them, I have to clarify, not the ruling elite over there in the Capitol. They all want centralized control, but so do the people on our side, for the most part, right?
Okay.
And so the Republicans, they want their form of big government republicanism that takes power away from us, and the Democrats want their form. If I had to choose one or the other, I'd choose Republican, but I don't like either of them. But when you talk to average people, and I ask this question to people all the time, and I speak in Berkeley, California, and I ask them, do you want Washington, D.C. to make your decisions for you? Do you want to make them here in Berkeley, California? They want to make them in Berkeley, California. We talk about self-governance, they talk about local control, local governance. A different language, same concept. So there are a lot of people on the left that are already in support of what we're doing.
But just to give an example right now with Obamacare, as it's imploding, there are folks on the left who have been saying all along, this is not going to work, and what they want is a single-payer system.
Right.
So they don't want the same thing. They don't want the decentralization that conservatives want. They want more centralization. Don't you see, if the left gets involved in this process, I mean, don't you see them pushing not for the same thing as you want, but more centralized power?
Well, so first of all, there's 2 pieces to what you said. One is about the definition of the alternatives.
Okay.
And so we conservatives tend to fight a losing battle because we allow the left to define the alternatives, and then we fight on their playing field.
Sure.
Right? And so the question isn't Obamacare versus something else that might have been Romney care, right? The question is Obamacare versus totally decentralized, give it back to the people. And if you talk to people on the left in the way I do, and I say, look, if Vermont wants single payer, I want them to have single payer. And every bit of money that now goes to Washington, D.C., I want to stay in Vermont and pay for their single payer system. They like that idea a lot. And I say, I don't want you to pay for whatever failures Texas does. That's not your problem. That's Texas's problem. They want to throw grandma off the cliff. They want to fail. They want to have a societal failure. That's their problem. It shouldn't be Vermont's problem. And when you talk to people on the left like that, they agree with us on the right. They don't want to be responsible for what goes on in Texas or or South Dakota. They want to run Vermont like Vermont, just like people in Texas want to run Texas like Texas. So a big part of it is not accepting the narrative that the choices come from Washington, D.C. The real choice facing America today is a real simple question. This is our narrative for everything, and the question is, who decides? Mm-hmm. And when you ask the people who should decide, they almost invariably say, I should decide. At home, me, my family, my community, my church, my town, my county. You ask people that question, almost nobody says, oh, well, we think the folks in Washington, D.C. should decide. So then the second part of the question is, now, what I presume you're asking, what happens when you get into convention? You got a bunch of people from the left that are in convention with you. What happens? Conventions, and we've done all the research on the history. Rob Natelson is the premier scholar in the history of state conclaves or conventions or commissions, including the Constitutional Convention of 1787. These conventions don't run away. They live within their bounds. It's what they've always done. And our convention, the call for the convention is to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. So anything that would expand the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the government is not germane in this convention and cannot be raised. Now, let's presume that that doesn't work and they raise all kinds of other stuff. And let's say that they can get the states to pass it out of convention. And now all they're doing is recommending amendments. Right. Now you have to pass whatever those amendments are in 38 states. I can't find 38 states on a grid for any radical right or radical left amendment. You have to get the vast majority of the American people on board or you can't pass anything.
So Vermont would be an interesting test if Vermont were calling for the Convention of the States, because the question is, do people? I mean, there's the far left, but there's also a liberalism that I don't think really wants socialism in one state. I mean, in a sense, you want the whole country to be that way. But this would be an interesting test for Vermont. Let's turn. I suspect a lot of you have questions about this, or even the deeper questions, and I think in many ways the more crucial questions about the cross, right, and so forth. But either can come from y'all right now, and let's as you can see, Mark is fully capable of dealing with anything you can throw at him. So throw things.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I do have a question, though, that I haven't understood to be answered so far. With the Convention of the States, what do you expect the states to do? What do you expect these states to come up with? And second question, I believe, and I may be incorrect, that the first Convention of the States was supposed to modify the Articles of Convention, and you said that they didn't step outside of their bounds. I think I would contend that that's not true, since they instead wrote an entire constitution. Can you answer those questions, please?
Sure. So we'll deal with them in sequence there. If you read Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, he proposes 11 amendments. 10 of them would be germane under our call. But to give you some specific examples, I guess my favorite would be a limitation of the Commerce Clause. The vast majority of the expansion of federal power has been done under the auspices of the Commerce Clause and the way that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Commerce Clause beyond any bounds of reason of original intent. The founders considered interstate commerce to be the moving of goods from one state to another. And so if we could redefine the Commerce Clause and limit the scope of the Commerce Clause, you could substantially hamper the expansion of the federal government and reduce the size of the federal government. Another is term limits for federal judges, specifically for the Supreme Court. My understanding is the average age of a Supreme Court justice appointed in the early years of the country was 45 years old, and average lifespan at the time was roughly 52 years old for males. So they expected people to serve on the court for a fairly short period of time. They didn't expect 20-year, 25, 30-year tenures where one justice would be able to affect constitutional jurisprudence for a generation or more. And so those are a couple of things. Term limits, the American people, 75% of the American people favor term limits on Congress. 23 states passed term limits on their congressional delegations and were told by the Supreme Court that they didn't have the right to do so. So these are things that would restrict the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. There are 7 more or 8 more in Levin's book, and a lot more have been proposed. As far as the original convention, you probably should go look at the Convention of States website. I could just tell you historically that you're incorrect. All but 2 of the delegations to that convention, if you read their charters, their commissions, they were commissioned to take any and all measures necessary to render the Constitution suitable for the exigencies of the Union. So whatever, in other words, whatever it took. It was incredibly broad. And the historic research is very clear. And of the two that potentially overstepped their bounds, we have recent research that shows one of them was probably arguably within their bounds. So the majority of them were within their bounds. The idea that this was a runaway convention, by the way, primarily comes from the left. And there are a lot of folks on the right that believe this and believe it very strongly. And we have a very staunch opponent of Article 5 in Eagle Forum and Phyllis Schlafly, who I have immense respect for. She draws most of her argument from a letter from Justice Warren Burger, the activist liberal justice who gave us Roe versus Wade, who in my opinion was defending his stance as an activist liberal justice who did not want a convention that could potentially limit the court's authority. So it's just historically, this is what I would call kind of an urban myth that has developed that was a runaway convention. And if you go to our site, all the historic documentation from the original materials is there on conventionofstates.com.
Yeah, I agree, by the way, on that history, that it really wasn't a runaway convention. But that's the myth that's out there.
Yeah, and it's it's a philosophical matter too. It's really important that we get this debate straight, because essentially, if we say that's a runaway convention, it's really hard to love the Constitution and believe in the Constitution and believe it was illegally adopted. It's kind of like Dr. Ferris has said. It's kind of like saying George Washington was this wonderful, amazing man who was the founder of our country, but by the way, he was also a British spy. Yeah, those things are incongruous, and so it's important that we look at the real history and get that straight.
Yeah. Other questions?
Mr. Meckler, thank you for coming here. Really appreciate it, especially your story about your personal faith journey. Very much resonated with me, and I'm sure with others as well. Thank you. I just had a quick question about something you had said earlier when you got started in this grassroots movement, and it sort of surprised you, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this organization occurred, which was the Tea Party Patriots. And then you said you noticed that it turned into sort of a big organization. So now you're involved in other projects. How do we, as conservatives or anyone else that's sort of involved in grassroots movements, keep things from turning into big organizations? How do we stop that? Or how do we make them, keep them effective still?
So those are two separate questions, really. How do we keep them from becoming traditional big organizations? I think probably the number one thing I would say is the humility of the leadership. As I travel around the country and I meet people who've grown big things, people become occupied with their position as the head of a big organization, or somebody who gets on television, or is the founder and head of a university. And so I think it's really important that whoever those people are who are rising in leadership are continually remind themselves, spend time in Scripture, and understand that the glory is never ours. I just had a chance to go to Israel. I spent 2 weeks in Israel, and the purpose of the Israel trip was we knew we were going into not just a political battle, but a spiritual battle here in this fight for the country. And we wanted to make sure that we steeled ourselves spiritually. So we studied a lot of Scripture over there on site, and one of the most impactful sites to me was Gideon Spring, and studying the story of Gideon, and Gideon being obviously this unwilling warrior and not expected to be a great military leader. And also how in that story it's so important that the glory is God's glory, that it's not the army that Gideon raises, it's not how smart Gideon is, it's not how brave Gideon is, it's that it's God's glory. And so after that day, and this is something that resonated throughout our trip, we know that we'll have great victories. And as you grow a big organization, you have great victories. Otherwise, you don't grow a big organization. And as soon as we start believing that those victories belong to us, that it's something that we're special or something that we've done that's so extraordinary, I think the organization starts to fall. And so I see a lot of that. And so I just know from my circumstances, I didn't grow the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement existed. God put me in a place where he felt like I could assist, and that's all I did was walk God's path. And so if people continue to try to walk God's path, not set their own path, not believe that they're responsible for what happens, I think that the organizations, big, huge organizations can, and we've seen plenty that stay true to their purpose.
Other questions? Hand up over here.
Thank you for speaking with us today. I think we missed part of the climax of your faith journey story. You ended with the TED Talks about how you started to, realize that there must be a creator. But what actually led you to finally accept Christ into your life?
So that's probably the most boring part of the story, which is there was no moment. I didn't have an aha moment. It was a very boring, lawyerly, logical progression, which is the more I read Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, and the more I read, I just got to this point where, to me, the evidence was overwhelming. But, everybody has to have a moment of faith because it's about faith. It's not about logic. And I would say, as a lawyer, that's a hard moment to have because we're taught to do everything on logic. As a science guy, you're taught to measure and quantify things. But so I would just say I came to a time where on my scale of logic, it made more sense to believe than to not believe. And I actually got to this point where I felt foolish in not believing. I felt like something is just making me resist believing. Like, I know I believe. I know the scales are like this now. Everything I read, everything I see in the world around me, every sign points me to believing in Christ and accepting Christ as my personal Savior. Okay, I accept Christ. I mean, it really was that non-climactic, and it was really comfortable when I did because I just had Christ had led me to that place where it was just obvious to me that I was a believer.
Yeah, same thing really with me, also coming from a Jewish background. At a certain point, it's inevitable. It really wasn't a choice at the end.
Right.
There was nothing else to do.
Right.
I had to do it. Let's see, maybe one last question here. If there isn't, then I'll ask it. How do you project the next few years? Timetable? And again, I think this will be really, it's one of the most interesting experiments going on now in American politics. But when do you think if things go according to what you hope they'll go, when do you think there actually would be such a convention?
So I have hopes, not expectations. I'll let God set the path for us, and I'll do my best to walk it. Our plan right now is that we pass 15 to 20 states, say, this year. And then in 2015, we finish that off. And in 16, ideally, we hold the convention. It's a great year for a convention because you'll have the presidential debate going on. And I would love both sides to have to take a position on whether they believe the federal government should be restrained in its scope, power, and jurisdiction. I want to hear somebody say, no, we shouldn't restrain the federal government in scope, power, and jurisdiction because that person will lose in an overwhelming landslide. So I want to have that debate during 16. Then I expect to have it out for ratification, say 17 and 18, and hopefully at the end of 18, be drinking a glass of sparkling cider and celebrating the new amendments to the Constitution.
One other question, how many people would be at this convention?
We don't know. Every state in our federal system would choose their own amount of delegates. Each state clearly has one vote. The question is, how many people do they send? They might send 2, they might send 100. So we really have no way to know what shape and form it would take.
Okay.
I'd like to close with one thing, if I could.
Please.
I have sitting behind my desk is a bust of Ronald Reagan. And I'm not a possessions guy. There aren't a lot of things that I value. My relationship with Christ, of course, my family, my friends. I value those things very highly. In my house, Tim Dunn asked me one time, if you had to save anything in your house, what would you save? And I couldn't think of anything, honestly. It was a little weird. I don't really just value possessions. That bust is really meaningful to me, and it's meaningful to me because it has a quote on it that it so represents what I've learned as I've traveled around the country. When I started in the Tea Party movement, I was probably pretty cynical. I kind of felt like we had the government we deserve, and I kind of felt like the American people were generally not that bright. And it's embarrassing to say that in hindsight. I've spent the last 5 years traveling the country from New York City to San Diego and everywhere in between. Literally, I think I've been in 47 states now. And everywhere I go, I meet amazing people. And I just mean amazing. People with brilliant ideas, people with deep faith, people with commitment to the country, people who are 70, 80 years old who are sacrificing everything to fight for their country, kids who are 14 years old that are fighting for their country. Everywhere I go. And so this quote on that Reagan bus really resonates to me. It's not one of his famous quotes, but it's my favorite. He says, they say we live in a time when there are no heroes. They just don't know where to look. And so for me, when I travel around, I'm always looking. And if you're looking, you see them everywhere. I mean, they're literally everywhere. You'll see them in the grocery store. You'll see them in your church. You'll see them on your school campus. You'll see them in people who you disagree with philosophically. There are heroes in this country, the same exact kind of heroes that founded this country, that have always been here and fought for this country in a time of need. They're out there, and there are plenty of them. You guys are among them. And so what I would say is have hope, have faith, and go out and be one of those heroes.
That's very true. There are heroes in this country. There are also heroes in China, Christians in China. And if you're interested in that, 12:20 tomorrow afternoon, Bob Fu, who's the head of China Aid.
One of my heroes.
And just a really gutsy guy. And he'll be able to talk about what's happening with Christians in China, the persecution that's going on there, and the way that Christian heroes in God's pleasure are emerging. And please pray for Mark, not just with your truck, but
the truck's okay. I don't need that anymore.
Other things too. And please join me in thanking Mark for coming here today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. That was awesome.